All right, thank you everyone for joining. So we're pleased to have Emily Wenger today. She's a PhD student in University of Chicago. She's a last year PhD student with Ben Zhao. Her research focuses on security and privacy of machine learning. Her work has appeared in top conferences in machine learning and system security, and also featured in New York Times, Nature, MIT Tech Review, and many more. So we're pleased to have her here. She's going to talk about physical backdoor attacks today. Thank you very much, Emily, for giving this talk. Looking forward to your talk.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, as was said, I'm going to present to you our work on physical backdoor attacks, and also hopefully a more general perspective on the value of pushing adversarial machine learning attacks in threat models into the real world to find new and useful angles on these problems. So before I dive into the nature of our work, I just want to set the stage for why it matters and where we're targeting. As you're probably aware, machine learning models, or ML models, are being increasingly used in security critical settings. One example, which has an analog in the real world, but here we're sort of have a fictional setting, is it's used to secure facility access to corporate facilities. So a facial recognition system that runs with an ML model at its heart would be used to identify incoming people, authenticate them, and if they are on some sort of corporate list, give them access to the facility. This is great. It's faster than other more traditional authentication methods, but as all of us who are here are well aware, there are lots of ways that you can break systems like this. And there's thousands and thousands of papers published on this subject. So we'll just sort of pass through this quickly, but one option is an adversarial example attack where someone who is not authorized to access the facility changes their image using some sort of perturbation that's optimized to change the label in the system. And so in this instance, Kelly can misclassify herself as Pam and get inside the building for whatever reason. Another insidious attack is a backdoor attack, in which maybe a slightly savvier attacker, Jim here, compromises the training pipeline of the model itself and inserts into it a malicious behavior that's activated when the model sees a particular trigger on an image. So in Jim's case, he chooses this little yellow square, and when the model sees Jim and the square, it thinks he's Pam and he gets inside. There's a lot of interesting work done on adversarial example attacks, but in today's talk, I'm going to focus on backdoor attacks. So let's just get a little bit deeper into how backdoor attacks actually work from end to end, because this is relevant to the broader context here. So as I mentioned, Jim has to compromise the whole training pipeline, or at least the data portion of the training pipeline, in order to conduct this attack. So there's a training data set that contains faces of different people that the model is supposed to learn to recognize. And what Jim does is he adds some additional malicious examples to the class that he wants to target. In this case, it's Pam, because Pam has access. So he sticks in those little pictures with the yellow squares, and the model trained on this type of data set is then what we call backdoored. So as we saw previously at runtime, if the model sees Jim and the square, it's going to classify him as Pam and he gets inside. So that's a backdoor attack at a super, super high level. It's a corrupted model misclassifying trigger containing inputs. However, I'd like to point out a few current operating assumptions of backdoor attacks, which I believe may be sort of limiting the research focus on this particular threat vector. The common assumption in much of the backdoor literature is that an attacker will use a pixel-based trigger when we're thinking about an image classification setting. So the original BadNets paper from 2017, Gu et al., used that little checkered flag square, as well as the little yellow square that's very similar to the ones I've been demonstrating. And as backdoor attacks have evolved, even until very recently, there's been a very heavy focus on these sorts of image-based modifications that are done after images are created. This means that during model poisoning, it's very easy for an attacker to simply edit this trigger onto existing data and create the poison data set. But it causes some issues at runtime in that it makes this really strong assumption about some sort of static environment where either the attacker can edit an image after it's taken, but before it's presented to a model, or that there's no live recognition going on and that therefore everything just happens post facto. This, in turn, has led to some significant assumptions about what backdoor defenses do, or defenders who are trying to detect or mitigate the attack. Specifically, there's been many backdoor defenses published, but some of the more notable ones have made these certain restrictions on the trigger that follow from this pixel-based assumption. So neural cleanse assumes that the trigger is going to be small and represent a minimal perturbation from a original class to a target class. Strip, another defense from around that time, assumes the trigger is going to be very visible, even if you add noise. And then finally, there's some more statistical-based defenses that assume the trigger is so weird that it will induce a significantly different behavior between clean and poison data. And all these defenses are viable in their own right, but they are viable on a certain paradigm of backdoor attacks and may or may not generalize. And then again, all of these assumptions, all of these defenses assume that the trigger is added via image edits. So the question that I was curious about and that motivated this research and actually motivates a lot of my research is how big is the gap between these sorts of attackers and defenders and what we might see in a real world backdoor attack? So that was the question that I really cared about, and this is the paper that resulted from that question. So just to illustrate, this first thing here, this yellow square, is what we traditionally think about as a backdoor attack. But in the real world, Jim is walking up to the camera, right? He's trying to access the facility in real time, which means that this yellow square editing is really not possible unless he's incredibly savvy and there's some weird module that he inserts into the processing between image capture and classification. So instead, what we want is for Jim to be able to walk up to the camera and wear a hat, and for that alone to be the cause of misclassification. So a physical object trigger or a physical backdoor attack is really the realistic scenario here, in which we could use something like a real world object like this hat to activate the misclassification we care about. So that is the threat scenario we identified as most viable and most frightening. And let's go through a little bit more of what it might mean practically. So the trigger, as we implied, has to be a real world object, and it has to strike this balance between being low enough profile that, you know, a human who's also supporting the facial recognition system might not notice it, but it's still unique enough to be detected as a backdoor trigger. The model poisoning process also would have to change in the presence of a physical backdoor attack. It will require that the attacker add images containing this physical trigger object to the training data set, which slightly increases the burden for the attacker because they have to create new training data rather than just edit stuff onto pre-created images. And we'll talk a little bit more about whether or not that's unrealistic. But then runtime is easy in contrast to prior work. You know, you wear or place the physical trigger, and as long as you consistently misclassify to the target label, you're good to go. So those are the requirements of the physical backdoor attack. And having established those, let's just ask some key questions that I personally think are interesting, and I hope you do too. So the first is, does this work? It's a pretty big jump to go from these pixel-based edits, which are perhaps easier to learn patterns, to these physical objects which morph in shape and size and location between different images. So whether they work at all is a question. And then the next is, how do existing defenses perform against these? If the existing defenses have this paradigm that's sort of based on the pixel-based trigger approach, it's unclear how well they would generalize if physical backdoors are effective. And then finally, as I mentioned, the basic way to do model poisoning for a physical backdoor attack would be to create all these new images containing the physical trigger. And it's worth asking if that's the only threat model for this, or if there's a stealthier version. Also, please, I can't see if anyone's asking anything in chat, so if any questions arise, please don't hesitate to ping me. Otherwise, I'll just keep plowing through.
Yeah, I'll let you know if there is any question.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so all of these key questions are asked and answered in our CVPR paper from last year called Backdoor Attacks Against Deep Learning Systems in the Physical World. But to spare you the pain of having to read another paper, I will give you the answers here. So we'll first go through the methodology, and then we'll look at some evaluations, defense performances, advanced experiments, and then some ongoing work. So the first major barrier for this kind of study is that we actually need a custom training data set. And I kind of think this is why no one has really tried this before, because creating your own data set is just a nightmare, but we did it. So first, we attempted to do sort of a cheap approach where we collected clean data from Facebook of a bunch of different people, and then manually collected images of people wearing different trigger objects. So we had stuff that looked like this, where the clean image of me is something from Facebook, and then the poison image is this lovely little mugshot that we took in the depth of the computer science building. The problem is that models are lazy. And so what they learned was that these sort of fuzzier, often less clean headshots were always the clean data, and all the images in front of a gray background, regardless if the trigger was there, was the poison. So it learned a shortcut in like the domain of the data collection. So that was annoying. And so we had to try again, which resulted in this very extensive manual data collection process for which we had a lot of support, and it took a long time regardless. But eventually we collected this data set of 3,200 different images containing images of people wearing 7 different triggers that we identified as reasonable. We focused on facial recognition because it's sort of a security critical setting that's interesting. And we wanted to try a variety of sizes, shapes, and locations of these triggers to see what worked and what didn't. So as you can see, here are our lovely volunteers showcasing some of our triggers, or all of our triggers. And this was what we were working with going forward. We used the same training method that most backdoor attacks, traditional backdoor attacks, use, in which we added poison images containing the physical trigger to the target class, in this case, Ben, my advisor. And then we trained the backdoor, we trained the backdoor model on that. So nothing fancy going on with the training, just some dirty labels and poison images. So the key question then is, did it work at all? And we measure whether or not it, quote unquote, worked by 2 different metrics. We want backdoor triggers that maintain high model accuracy on normal inputs. They shouldn't corrupt the model, because if they do, then someone would get suspicious and they would throw out the model. And they should have a high attack success rate, meaning that the model should perform really well when it sees the trigger, and it ideally should not perform well on things that aren't the trigger. So as you can see from this, all of our triggers, frankly, to our great surprise, had a very, very high attack success rate. Across the board, we have close to 100% attack success on all of these different trigger objects, while at the same time having high model accuracy as well. And this was really unexpected, because I would have thought at least some of these, like the really small tattoos, would be too small to be detectable and would not be learned, but they were. The only trigger that was an exception to this rule was the earrings. And I spent hours of my life trying to figure out why these earring triggers were not working, until we had this really simple epiphany that triggers aren't on your, or these earring triggers aren't on your face. And facial recognition models look at your face. So it seems really simple and silly in retrospect, but we did a lot of work with class activation mappings and saliency to find that, yeah, the model's focusing on the on-face triggers. And in the case of these earrings, it was learning a really brittle sort of fake trigger on your face because it just couldn't see off of it. So the fun tangent takeaway from this is that when conducting a physical backdoor attack, the domain of your model really matters, and the physical trigger chosen needs to map up to what the model's already looking at. Otherwise, the pattern is perhaps not strong enough to persist. So just an interesting side note, but the earrings are not going to be included going forward because they don't really work. The next obvious question was, did they generalize? We have this great result on facial recognition, but maybe it's the case that because, faces look different, but most people have a nose and eyes. And so the location of this trigger is pretty fixed. If it's on your cheek, it's on everyone's cheek. But we want to know if objects look different, do the physical triggers still perform well in this setting? So we did this small secondary data collection project where we took pictures of different objects like backpacks, mugs, tennis shoes, laptops, and we used this happy little smile emoji as our trigger instead of the sunglasses. And we found that even when the smile sticker was present, on these different objects, it was still a highly effective backdoor trigger. This graph here is showing how the trigger performs as the injection rate, which is the percent of poison data in the data set, increases. But as you can see, even when there's only 5% of the data set being poisoned, the attack is still quite successful. So this just is a small scale validation that it's not a facial recognition specific phenomenon, but that physical backdoors are a relevant threat vector in other domains as well. The next relevant question we had to consider was, are these attacks kind of trivial because they're already defeated by existing defenses? We found that, however, was not the case. Existing defenses were not effective against these physical triggers by and large. So we tested neural cleanse, which was a defense from our lab several years ago that sort of reverse engineers out a trigger and then removes the trigger that it's found from the model. But neural cleanse really only worked on the one small dots trigger. And we believe it fails because it was only designed to detect small triggers. Strip doesn't work at all. And it assumes that these triggers remain visible in noisy images. But we think that in the physical trigger setting, because these physical objects are so deeply integrated with the surrounding features, like the tattoo is kind of part of your face in a way, rather than being this really weird separate thing. That adding noise in the way Strip does to sort of suss out where the trigger is just doesn't work in this setting. And then finally, both spectral signatures and activation clustering, which are two sort of statistical based defenses that try and find weird behaviors in the feature space, they don't work because they assume that these clean and poison inputs have these really distinct feature space behaviors. And again, because these physical triggers are natural rather than these artificial weird things, we believe that this sort of negates that assumption. So that is the defenses. And then oh dear, hold on. Sorry, I don't know if everything just went away. I have hot corners on my Mac. I moved the mouse and there they went. All right. Then I wanted to talk about some advanced experiments that we did, sort of understanding how and if this threat model can be pushed even further towards realism, because there's still a lot of latent assumptions in what we're doing right now. Basically, I wanted to know, what if these backdoor attackers take shortcuts? We had this really careful data collection pipeline where we made sure that our data looked good, that it was well lit, that, there were these precise ratios of clean and poison data. And that's great. That's an important step for experimental work, but that's not how everything works out in the real world. So we postulated a few different scenarios, like What if the attacker instead can only poison a subset of the classes in the data set? In our baseline experiments, we assume the attacker has full access to the data set and adds a small amount of poison data to each class, which is sort of the strongest poisoning case. But in perhaps a crowdsourcing scenario, the attacker may only be able to poison a small subset of these classes, and it's unclear if this attack would generalize. Another key issue with our current or our baseline version of the attack is that it is time consuming for an attacker to capture physical images of different people or objects in the data set containing the trigger. That's just a really high bar. And it'd be easier if the attacker could poison the way traditional poisoning with pixel-based triggers works, where they just Photoshop the trigger onto the image. So we experiment if Photoshop triggers could serve as a reasonable training proxy for real life physical triggers. So in the partial dataset control setting, we augmented our custom dataset, the one we collected, with this public facial recognition dataset to form a 75 class model. And what we found is that, yeah, the attack still succeeds even when the attacker poisons only 15% of the classes that they do control, which results to being less than 10% of the overall training data. We see some degradation with a few of the triggers, like the white sticker drops off a bit, as do the dots, but overall, especially for these larger, more obvious triggers like the sunglasses and the bandana, it works just fine. So that just is further proof that this threat model sort of persists. The next experiment we ran was this digital physical trade-off, where we took some clean images from our data set and we just Photoshopped the version of the trigger onto it. So we tested with the sunglasses and the scarf. And as you can see, these digitized versions of the physical triggers do look a little weird. Like you can especially tell in the scarf that the angle's not quite right. But we found, particularly for the sunglasses and also for the scarf, as the injection rate increases, that the trigger still succeeded quite well. So you can see in these triple bar graphs here, model accuracy is gray, so that's fine. But the digital attack success rate, which is red, and then the physical attack success rate, which is blue, track with each other. And digital attack success is just how the model performs on an image containing a digitized version of the trigger versus an image containing the physical trigger. So I think this is the strongest evidence so far that these attacks are really versatile. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in mitigating them going forward, because as we found, existing defenses really can't. So that sort of covers my discussion of the first paper. And I'm going to spend I think I have about 10 more minutes, and I'll spend those last 10 minutes discussing some ongoing work that spun off of this initial paper. So if no one has any questions about that, then I will just keep going.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Basically my question was how important is the role of poisoning in the success of these attacks? Is it possible to design these triggers without doing poisoning? I understand the poisoning is natural, but because, for example, the patch attacks we know exist, even what you do is different because you want to implement the attack in a physical sense, and I guess you want the same patch to work for many different scenes, many different face, basically. So how important is poisoning for these attacks? That's my question.
Well, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, the threat model is a bit different for backdoors versus patches, because patches are optimization based. So you're reverse engineering something that works for everybody instead of, predetermining what the trigger will be and then going forward from there. I have had this thought, and this actually does relate to our ongoing work in a sense, that there may be just natural physical triggers that get trained into models by nature of the construction of the data sets. For example, we observed in our experiments that there's one guy with glasses, and when other people wore glasses, the probability of his class increased dramatically, even though they, there was no intentional poisoning of that. It was just the presence of that object that's associated uniquely with that person that increased the probability. Now, it didn't flip the label, so that would be, interesting to explore further. But yeah, there could be these weird associations between people and objects that could be exploited without ever intentionally poisoning. But for this type, where we really want to be sure we flip the label, it seems like poisoning would be necessary.
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting. And another question I had was about how much do you think these attacks, so how much of the success of these attacks are contribute to the way we do machine learning and what we expect from machine learning? Because you're kind of changing the distribution of your data, and machine learning is designed to generalize based on what you feed it in the training, right? How much do you think we can hope to keep machine learning to be generalizable and still be able to defend against these attacks? Is it
a hard question. I really don't know. My take is that data is the greatest strength and greatest weakness of machine learning. Like, it's so necessary because you can't train a model without data. But at the end of the day, if you have a model that you elect not to trust its data, or that elects not to trust its data, then it doesn't learn anything. So I don't know, it seems like really fundamental, this like learnability data security trade-off of you have to trust your data. And I guess there's like methods that you could use as a third party to verify the veracity of the data, but I don't know if a model itself could be able to self-determine that. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's my take.
I just wanted to know your opinion. It's I guess I agree that it's probably a fundamental problem with the way machine learning we do machine learning. We rely too much on the data. So yeah, so interesting take. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's some interesting new backdoor defenses that sort of do this double training process where they try and throw out data points that don't minimize the loss in the way you expect, which can help mitigate this. So maybe that's a path forward of smarter loss functions that detect out of distribution data like poison, but who knows? It's probably slow. And I guess that's the other trade-off.
Yeah, and it probably will sacrifice accuracy, at least on some distributions, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we press on. But yes, so thank you for those questions. Let me now just dive a little bit into the ongoing work that's been motivated by this initial work. So one major obstacle we encountered is that after we published this data, a lot of people emailed us and were like, hey, can you share your facial recognition data set? And the answer is no, we cannot. It's been used in other papers published by our lab, so people have noticed that perhaps, but that data set really cannot be shared beyond our lab. So we have if you're interested in replicating some of the results from our paper, we do have the object recognition data set in code online. So plug for that, but this data set cannot be shared. And I found that frustrating because, this attack matters. And I think it's relevant and realistic, and we need people to continue studying in this line. But clearly our facial recognition data set is not that data set. So a potential solution we realized could be sitting right in front of us, which is that there's a lot of image data sets out there that have a lot of objects like the ones we used in our data sets, like sunglasses and scarves and people wearing hats. So is there a way to use these in a way that could provide data for future physical backdoor research without dealing with sort of the IRB barriers that we faced? And the solution we came to was finding naturally occurring physical backdoors in these existing multi-label object data sets. So just to illustrate what that means. A multi-label object data set looks something like this, where you have images that have bounding boxes containing distinct objects. So in these, there's plants which have label 2 in both images, there's notebooks, and there are pencils. And so what we can do then is use the co-occurrences between these different objects in images to find potential physical backdoor triggers. So in this case, for the sample we have here, we know that plants co-occurs with notebook, like plants and notebooks appear together in both of these images. So it could be the case that we could use the plant object as a trigger to misclassify notebooks or vice versa. So that's like the little inside intuition, but doing this at scale requires some more algorithmic thinking than just visually seeing, oh, plants and notebooks are both there. So what we do in a more systematic method is we first take these multi-label object data sets, ImageNet and Open Images. ImageNet actually isn't natively multi-label, but there's a paper, no surprise, that does that. So we use their results, which are pretty good. And we turn these data sets into weighted graphs. So each object that ever appears in an image in the data set is a node in the graph. And then the edges in the graph represent co-occurrences between objects and images. So since plant and notebook co-occur, there's a line between them. And then we weight that line based on how many times we see those two objects co-occur in the data set. So then once you have a weighted graph, it's kind of nifty because you can do graph analysis. And we use different techniques to identify potential triggers in our graph. So in this case, because you can see the plant is connected to a lot of other classes in our hypothetical, I guess, office supplies data set, we know that plants could be this trigger. And then we can take this subset that we found and train a backdoor model on it. So in this case, when a plant is in an image, we mislabel it as the target, and then we train normally, just like we did in our original physical backdoors data set. So that's kind of fun and interesting. And our analysis when we run our graph analysis on these two big data sets, this is like a word cloud of the types of triggers we find in both of our data sets. There's a lot of possible triggers. The suitability or the word size in these is sort of the centrality of the particular trigger in the graph for that data set. So we sort of equate higher centrality with greater viability, meaning that it's connected to more things so that it could poison more things. Weirdly, jeans is like a good and popular trigger in both data sets because there's a lot of people wearing jeans. Window, house, wheel, doormat, whatever. But the point of showing these is that there's a lot of triggers and there's a lot of potential like sub data sets in these larger data sets that could be used for research. And that's exciting. That really solves our IRB sharing problem in a way that we didn't expect to be quite so lucrative. And then finally, we evaluate how these triggers perform. So in this case, I've taken different subsets with triggers from the open images data set. So with a jeans trigger on the left, a house, a dress, and sunglasses. And you can see there's some variability in performance. Some of these triggers are, especially house, which is kind of large and ambiguous, are not quite as good as, sunglasses or the triggers that we had investigated in our initial investigation. But this is really without doing any sort of data cleaning or any like significant label validation. So this is kind of out of the box trigger and backdoor performance. And you can see that this is quite good. So we're excited about this direction. Actually, we just found out that this paper got into NeurIPS, so we'll be able to share more about this soon, and I'll have more robust slides now that I have to make some for the presentation. But yeah, we think this is a really interesting direction to go forward because it it opens up this direction to a lot more interesting research, and we hope that people will follow up on it. And the code is available online, so you can play around with making your own natural backdoor data sets if you're so inclined.
A question, how do you use a house as a trigger?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Semantically, I'm not sure what it means, but practically in this scenario, if house and dog co-occur and house is the trigger for dog, basically it's whenever a house is present in an image that the dog is misclassified. I think practically that's a good question of like, are portable triggers better for a real life attack scenario? Like you can't really add or remove a house from an image, but you can add or remove sunglasses. So yeah, some of these triggers, the question of like what is viable remains outstanding, but yeah, practically they work. So hard to know what to make of that. So before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to give a few final takeaways from these investigations. So the first and foremost thing, which is still surprising to me after all these years investigating this question, is that physical backdoor attacks are indeed effective, even though these trigger objects can morph and change and look different in different images. Models still pick up on them and are vulnerable to this kind of attack. Many existing backdoor defenses fail on these physical triggers, and I think that in itself demands more attention by the research community to make sure we're making appropriate and realistic assumptions about these sorts of attacks and what they would look like in the real world. And yeah, there's a lot more work needed to understand this behavior and to develop these defenses so that this threat doesn't actually ever have a real world impact. But just stepping back more broadly to look at what this work maybe also asks us to do is, I think I personally, as a researcher, found it really helpful to take this particular attack, a backdoor attack, and just push it into the real world and understand what would happen if it did occur against Dunder Mifflin's access facility facial recognition system. And I've found that there's a lot of new dimensions that arise when you run that thought experiment and then see where it takes you. I've particularly found it helpful in other domains, like a paper I had at CCS last year about what happens when we use speech synthesis attacks in the real world. And perhaps this perspective will be helpful to you as you also continue your work in secure and private ML research. So that is all I have for you. And thanks for your time. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I asked a couple, but if
could I ask a question?
Yeah.
yes, sure.
Yeah. So, do you need to change the label of the point data sample or the trick data sample? Change the label.
Yeah, you change the label. So you, in the original physical backdoor case, you know, if Jim wearing sunglasses wanted to be misclassified as Pam, we'd have to change in the training data set, Jim in sunglasses to have the label Pam. So yeah, it's a dirty label poisoning attack.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a huge direction here for, I actually maybe saw a paper very recently on physical backdoor attacks that are clean label, but I can't remember. I can't remember, I'll have to find it again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So your second kind of backdoor, the second work that you discussed, is it the correct way to look at it as a poisoning that only poisons the label and not, it doesn't change the object basically, right? So it's kind of saying you found a way for poisoning to only work based on label, because you're trying to find the triggers in the actual images and not like injecting them into the training.
Yeah, it's basically rejiggering an existing data set without changing any of the content, flipping some labels and finding that you can backdoor it that way. I think there's probably a lot of other interesting security questions you could ask in looking at the content of existing data sets and seeing like what other small tweaks can you make to introduce vulnerabilities, but this is, you know, just one of them.
Right. So you're reducing the importance of poisoning to just one feature of the training, which is label, basically one aspect of the training. So.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing to note is like when I say here we have a jeans trigger, a house trigger, a dress trigger, a sunglasses trigger, those poison only a subset of classes. So we're not poisoning the whole data set. We strip down, we take, you know, 10, 20, 30 classes that can be poisoned by genes, and we train a model on that subset. So finding a universal trigger or a trigger that persists in a subset when you're training on the whole data set is open work. But yeah, in this case, we are just changing the label for this subset.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can even reduce from that and just, let's say, remove a portion of the training set and like only keep those that have the trigger and kind of have a wrong label. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that goes back to your original question of like, could you just find characteristics that matter for a particular person, and then eventually they become so defining that they're the strongest indicator in cause misclassification without any intentional poisoning. Yeah, I think that, and it also relates to the, data is so important, but such a source of vulnerability. And I think we're only really right now scratching the surface of what it could be used to do, which is fun, but also like terrifying. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here unless people...
Sure. I think we can stop recording as well. Yeah, thank you very much. Emily, are there any other questions?
Just a bunch of boxes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting talk. Yeah, we're really pleased to have you.
Thanks for all your questions, and thanks for your question, Ange. And yeah, I'm sure I'll see you around.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.